The gravy hadn't even stopped steaming when my mother looked at me across the Christmas table, smiled, and announced that the house was finally sold. "We closed on your grandmother's place last month," she said, swirling her wine glass. "You were never in the will anyway." My sister snorted into her napkin. "Good. She would have just wasted it on that little office of hers." 11 faces turned toward me, waiting to watch me fall apart. I didn't. None of them knew that the deed to that farmhouse already had a name on it, sitting in my purse, right beside my chair. And in about 90 seconds, that name was going to turn Christmas dinner into the quietest room in the entire county. Welcome back to Arms Never Sleep, where ordinary people run into impossible families and answer them with quiet steel instead of shouting. If a story has ever made you set your coffee down and whisper "good for her," then you're exactly where you need to be. My name is Simone Finch. I'm 34, and I do the books for the farms around Cedar Hollow. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe, because I need to take you back almost a year to explain how I ended up at that table holding a deed. It started on a Tuesday in February. I was reconciling the ledgers for Hartley Dairy when the call came. My grandmother Opal had taken a turn for the worse overnight, and I was the one they called. I was always the one they called. Not my mother, who lived 20 minutes across town, not my sister Brooke, who lived even closer. Me. Because for 8 years, I'd been the one driving out to the farmhouse on Cedar Hollow Road with her medication, her tax paperwork, her groceries, and a thermos of coffee for the long mornings. I shut my laptop, taped a note to the office door, and drove out past the frozen fields. Opal was sitting up in bed when I arrived, smaller than I remembered, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. She held my hand for a long while without saying much. Then she reached into her nightstand drawer and pressed a small key into my palm. The key to the old tin recipe box she'd kept on her kitchen shelf since before I was born. "When the time comes," she said, "you'll know where to look." I asked what she meant. She just squeezed my hand and told me to drink my coffee before it went cold. I slid the key into my coat pocket and didn't think much of it. I assumed she was just tired, talking the way older people do when the medication softens the edges of things. I was wrong about that. The way I turned out to be wrong about a lot that year, though I wouldn't understand any of it until the house was already gone. That farmhouse was the one place I ever truly felt like I belonged. I grew up in town, in my parents' tidy ranch house, where every conversation felt like a performance review. But summers belonged to Opal. She taught me to snap beans on the porch and read a feed invoice closely enough that the co-op couldn't shortchange her. She'd spread the farm's receipts across her kitchen table and have me add the columns out loud. "Numbers don't lie, Simone," she'd tell me. "People do. So learn the numbers." That kitchen was where I decided who I wanted to be. I opened Finch and Company Bookkeeping at 22 in a rented room above the hardware store because my parents wouldn't help pay for college, and it was Opal who slipped me her egg money for the first month's rent. My mother thought the whole thing was beneath the family. My sister thought it was dull. Opal thought it was the finest thing anyone in our family had ever done. While I drove out there every single week, my mother visited twice a year, usually to ask what the land might be worth. Brooke showed up for holidays and left early. I'm not saying any of this to sound like a martyr. I'm saying it because of something Opal told me during our last good autumn together, sitting in her garden with dirt under both our fingernails. She looked at the house, then at me, and said it plainly. "This place goes to the one who stayed." I laughed it off, told her not to talk that way, that she had years left. She didn't argue. She just gave me that smile, the one she wore when she knew something I didn't, and went back to her tomatoes. I should have asked her to explain. I didn't. I thought there'd be time. Opal died in her sleep 3 days after handing me that key. The funeral fell on a gray Saturday, and I organized all of it, picked the hymns she loved, ordered the flowers, wrote the obituary, and stood at the door thanking neighbors who'd known her for 60 years. My mother, Sharon, wore black and accepted condolences like royalty greeting subjects. My father, Raymond, stood beside her and said almost nothing, which summed up his entire personality. Brooke spent most of the reception on her phone. I noticed, because grief has a way of making everything simultaneously too loud and too quiet. What sticks with me most isn't the grief. It's the math. Before the casseroles had even cooled, my mother leaned over and asked what I thought the farmhouse would sell for. I thought I'd misheard her. Then Brooke wandered through the house with her phone raised, photographing the hutch, the quilts, the grandfather clock, murmuring prices under her breath like she was already at an estate sale. "That clock's worth something," she said. "And the land, Mom, the land's the real money." My father studied his shoes. Nobody asked who'd feed Opal's old barn cat. Nobody asked where her garden tools should go. They asked what it was worth. I stood in my grandmother's kitchen, next to the tin box she'd told me about, and felt something cold settle in my chest. I told myself it was grief. I told myself families act strange around death, that they didn't mean it the way it sounded. I thought the worst part was already behind me, that nothing could hurt more than losing her. I was wrong. The worst part hadn't even started. It began with a phone call about a will. In April, my cousin Wade scheduled a family meeting to read the will. Wade Cobb is on my mother's side, a part-time notary who runs a tax and title shop 2 towns over and always smells faintly of cigarettes and cologne. The meeting wasn't held at a lawyer's office. It happened at my parents' kitchen table, over coffee cake with a manila folder. That alone should have told me something. Wade put on his reading glasses and announced that Opal had left everything: the house, the land, the accounts, to my mother. "The wonderful daughter-in-law," he read aloud, "who cared for me in my final years." My mother dabbed at her eyes. Brooke squeezed her hand. My name wasn't in the document at all. Not as a beneficiary, not as a witness, not even in a footnote. "You were never in the will anyway, honey," my mother said, and there was the faintest curl at the corner of her mouth. I sat very still. I'm good at sitting very still. But inside, 2 things were screaming at me. First, wonderful daughter-in-law was a phrase Opal would have choked on before writing. She and my mother had circled each other like rival cats for 3 decades. Second, the signature. I'd watched my grandmother sign 100 documents in my life. This signature was careful, even steady. The Opal I'd just buried couldn't hold a spoon in her final weeks, let alone sign her name that cleanly. And the date typed at the bottom claimed the will had been made just 3 weeks before she died. 3 weeks. I said none of that out loud. I thanked Wade for his time, took a slice of coffee cake I never touched, and drove back to my office with steady hands on the wheel and my mind already running numbers. Here's the thing about being the family bookkeeper. People assume you only notice what's handed to you. They forget you also notice what's missing. That night, I sat at my desk and laid everything out the way Opal had taught me to lay out a ledger. 2 years earlier, I'd driven her to an attorney's office in the county seat. She told me she was getting her affairs in order and made me wait in the lobby, which was very like her. She came out an hour later with a sealed envelope and a business card she tucked into her purse. I never saw the actual documents, but I knew they existed. So how did a will drafted by a real estate attorney 2 years ago turn into a will notarized by Wade just 3 weeks before she died? Wills get updated, sure. But Opal hadn't left the farmhouse in 6 months. She couldn't have driven to an attorney's office, and Wade had never once set foot at the farmhouse. I'd have known. I called him the next morning and asked plainly when exactly my grandmother had signed the new will. He turned vague fast. "She had me come by," he said. "Last-minute change of heart happens all the time, Simone." I asked who'd witnessed it. He said he'd have to check his file. A notary who has to check whether anyone witnessed a will is a notary telling you something without meaning to. I thanked him and hung up, then sat a long time staring at the corner of my desk where I keep things I can't bring myself to throw away. That's when I remembered the business card. 2 years earlier, in that lobby, Opal had pressed a card into my hand, just in case, and I'd filed it away without a second thought. Margaret Howren, estate law. Before calling the lawyer, I tried the reasonable thing first. I asked my own family for the truth. I drove to my parents' house and asked to see the actual probate filing, the official one, not Wade's coffee cake folder. My mother's whole expression shifted. "Why would you need that?" she asked. I told her I just wanted to read it. Reading documents is what I do for a living. That's when she reached for the weapon she'd used on me my whole life, She made herself the victim. "I cannot believe you," she said, voice wobbling. "Your grandmother is barely in the ground and you're already fighting over money." Brooke appeared in the doorway right on cue. "Don't make this ugly, Simone. So like you to turn everything into a drama." My father studied the wallpaper. I looked at the three of them and finally understood something I should have realized years earlier. They weren't confused. They weren't grieving badly. They had a plan, and the plan required me to be quiet, ashamed, and gone. So I went quiet, just not the way they wanted. I drove back to my office and didn't call to apologize, because for once I had nothing to apologize for. They thought they'd handled me. They thought the bookish daughter would fold, because she always folded, because keeping the peace had always been my assigned job. What they forgot is what I actually do for a living. I spend my days finding the number somebody worked very hard to hide. I find it in the rounding. I find it in dates that don't line up. And there was a date that didn't line up, sitting inside a will my own cousin couldn't explain. So the next morning, I called Margaret Howren. Her assistant put me straight through the moment I mentioned my grandmother's name, which told me something before the lawyer even picked up. Margaret was careful on the phone, the way good attorneys always are, and asked me to come in person with identification. We scheduled it for the following week. In the meantime, I did what I always do when I'm frightened. I gathered facts. I learned the estate was already moving. Fast, too fast. My mother had petitioned the court as executor under an informal, uncontested probate, the kind that sails through quickly when no heir objects. A court reviews a will on its face. It doesn't test a signature unless someone contests it, and no one had. The required notice to family had gone to an old address I'd left years ago, arriving late, after the window to object had nearly closed. Margaret never heard a word, because no one is required to notify the attorney who drafted an earlier will. On paper, Wade's document looked perfectly clean. The probate had sailed through on the strength of it. Now there was a notice that the farmhouse and land would be sold to settle the estate, sold to whoever showed up with cash. That evening, I drove to Cedar Hollow Road and parked at the end of the long gravel drive. The house sat there in the blue dusk, Opal's porch swing still hanging crooked the way it always had. I pictured strangers walking through those rooms. I pictured someone ripping out her garden to put in a pool. And I made myself a promise right there in the cold. Whatever the law eventually decided about that forged signature, it would take months to prove, and the house would be long gone by then. I couldn't stop the sale in time. But nothing was stopping me from being the one who bought it. If you've ever watched something precious slide toward people who never earned it, you already know the particular quiet that settled over me that night. It wasn't defeat. It was a decision. Let me pause here for a second. If you've ever been the one who showed up, every appointment, every form, every hard night, only to watch the people who vanished decide they deserved the reward, you already recognize this feeling in your chest. Stay with me, because what I did next surprised even me. Hit subscribe so the rest of this story finds you. People assume rage is loud. Mine looked like a legal pad. The night I decided to buy the house back, I sat at my kitchen table above the office and made a list, because lists are how I think. On one side, what I knew. The will was almost certainly fake. The sale was almost certainly proceeding anyway. My family was almost certainly already spending money they hadn't even received yet. On the other side, what I could control. Not their behavior. Not the court's timeline. Just my own moves, made cleanly, made legally, made in the right order. My mother's voice kept looping in my head. You were never in the will anyway. I let it. I didn't push it away. I let it sit there and turn into fuel, because anger, understand, is something you can aim. Then I started researching how estate properties get liquidated when an executor needs cash fast, and I found the word that changed everything: auction. The estate wasn't arranging a quiet private sale to some pre-selected buyer. To move quickly and demonstrate fairness to the court, the property was headed to a public estate auction, open to anyone with the funds and the nerve to raise a paddle. My mother believed she was selling her mother-in-law's house to some faceless investor. She had no idea the auction floor would be open to me too. I sat back and felt something I hadn't felt since the funeral. Not peace, exactly, Purpose. I had a number to find and a plan to build, and for the first time in months, I wasn't the one being managed. I was the one running numbers nobody else knew were being run. Margaret Howren's office smelled like old paper and good coffee. She was trim, in her late 50s, reading glasses on a chain and a handshake that meant business. I put my license on her desk. She looked at it, then at me, and something in her shoulders relaxed. "You look like her," she said, and opened a file 2 inches thick. 2 years earlier, she told me, my grandmother had come in deliberate and clear-headed and drafted a will. It was signed, witnessed by 2 of Margaret's own staff, and properly notarized. In it, Opal left the farmhouse and the surrounding 10 acres to me, to Simone, the one who stayed. Margaret read it aloud, and I had to look toward the window for a moment. The accounts were split among the family, but the house was mine, in black and white, executed the right way. Then I told her about Wade's version, the steady signature from a dying woman, the 3 weeks before date, the kitchen table reading. Margaret's expression went flat and professional, which is how attorneys look when they're furious. "I drafted the operative will," she said. "No one contacted me about a revocation. A valid later will can supersede an earlier one, but it has to actually be valid." She tapped the file. "If your cousin's document is what you suspect, the will currently in probate is fraudulent, and everything done under it can be challenged." I asked the obvious question. Where was the original, signed copy of the real will? Margaret had a conformed copy in her own file, but the executed original, the one Opal had insisted on keeping herself, sat in a safe deposit box at Cedar Hollow Bank. Accessing it would require the key and paperwork Opal had arranged in advance. A key. A box. I felt the cold memory of that tin recipe box press against my thoughts. The next morning, I drove out to the farmhouse one final time before it changed hands. The estate company hadn't locked it yet, and I still had the key Opal had given me years before. The back door, one that always stuck if you didn't lift it just right. I let myself in, and the smell hit me first. Lavender, wood smoke, her. Everything sat exactly where she'd left it. I went straight to the kitchen, to the shelf above the stove where the tin recipe box had lived my entire life. I took the small key from my coat pocket, the one she'd pressed into my hand back in February, and it fit. Inside, tucked beneath an index card, stained with decades of gravy and pie filling, I found 2 things. The first was a flat brass key in a small envelope marked in her handwriting, Cedar Hollow Bank, Box 114. The second was a sealed letter with my name on the front, in her looping cursive. Just Simone. I stood in that kitchen holding both, and my hands, which never shake, shook. I understood exactly what the brass key was for. The bank box, the original will, the thing that could unravel my family's entire story. But the letter was different. The letter was her voice, and I wasn't ready to hear it yet. So I did something not entirely rational. I took the bank key, slid the still-sealed letter into my bag, and carried it around for 3 days without opening it. Some truths, once released, can't be folded back up. Part of me knew whatever she'd written would ask something of me, and I wanted to be strong enough to do it before I read what that something was. While I worked up the nerve to open the letter, I built the machinery that would let me fight. I formed a company, not out of some cloak and dagger instinct, but because I needed a way to bid on that house without my mother spotting my name and jacking up the price out of pure spite. So I did what plenty of buyers do, entirely above board. I registered a limited liability company called Cedar Hollow Holdings. On public records, only the company name would appear. The law still required me to privately report myself as the true owner to the Federal Registry, which I did because I do everything by the book. But my family, scanning auction paperwork, would only see a name they'd never heard of, never connecting it to the daughter they'd written off. Then came the harder part, money. The farmhouse and its 10 acres had been appraised around $215,000. That's not a fortune in a big city, but it's a mountain to climb when you keep books over a hardware store. I'd been careful for 12 years, though. I had real savings tied up in the business. I had a small inheritance from my grandfather I'd never touched, because Opal had told me to save it for something that mattered. And I qualified for a mortgage under the company's name to cover the rest. I spent 2 nights stress testing every number the way I'd never let a client overextend themselves. I could do it, barely, but cleanly. And there was one more piece of cold arithmetic working in my favor. My mother needed cash and fast, which meant she'd set the reserve price low to guarantee a quick sale. A low reserve is a door left open. I planned to walk right through it. In the middle of all that planning, Brooke called to gloat, though she didn't realize that's what she was doing. She thought she was sharing good news. She'd put a deposit down on a new SUV. Loaded, she said. 3rd row, the works. She was covering it, she explained, using her share of Grandma's estate, money that hadn't even cleared yet. I asked, mildly, whether that was wise before the sale had closed. That's when she said it, breezy as anything, like it cost her nothing. Oh, come on. If Grandma had left it to you, you'd have just wasted it on that dusty little office. There it was. The same line my mother had used at the will reading, just wearing a different outfit. You'd just waste it. As if 8 years of driving out to that farmhouse counted as waste. As if keeping someone's books and someone's company and someone's dignity intact at the end of her life amounted to nothing. I felt the old urge rise up, to defend myself, to list every appointment and every form until she understood. I didn't. I'd finally learned you don't explain your worth to people who've already decided you don't have any. So I just said, we'll see. There was a small pause on the line, like she'd expected more of a fight and didn't quite know what to do without one. Anyway, she said, and pivoted to talking about upholstery. After we hung up, I sat with my tea going cold and thought about the auction, now 11 days out. I thought about Brooke signing for a car with money that was about to become the most expensive mistake of her life. And for the first time, I let myself smile about it, just a little, just in the privacy of my own kitchen. The night before I met with Margaret to plan the bank box visit, I finally opened my grandmother's letter. I made tea I never drank and sat in the chair by the window, sliding my thumb under the seal. Her handwriting filled 2 pages, steady in a way her forged signature had suspiciously tried to imitate. She wrote the way she talked, no wasted words. She told me she'd known. Known Sharon was underwater financially. Known about the second mortgage and the failed ventures. Known that once she was gone, there'd be hands reaching for the house before the flowers even wilted. I've watched it coming for years, she wrote. Your mother loves money the way some people love whiskey, and she'll tell herself any story to get more of it. Then she told me what she'd done. The real will, sitting in the bank box, with Margaret's name on it. The house left to me, deliberately, in writing. And then the line I've since read so many times I could recite it in my sleep. If they ever tell you that you were never in my will, you put this letter on the table and let the paper speak. Don't fight them with shouting. Simone, you were never any good at it, and it isn't your strength. Numbers are your strength. Quiet is your strength. The house goes to the one who stayed. That's you. It was always you. I sat there a long while. Then it came. Not the pretty movie kind of crying, but the ugly, hiccuping kind that arrives when someone reaches out from beyond death and tells you they saw you all along. Eventually, I wiped my face, folded the letter back along its worn creases, and put it somewhere safe. Because now I wasn't just buying back a house. I was carrying out the final clear instruction of the only person who'd ever truly believed in me. 2 days later, Margaret and I opened safe deposit box 114 at Cedar Hollow Bank. Opal had thought of this part too. Years earlier, she'd quietly added me as a co-signer on the box, my signature already on file, so it never froze after her death and I could open it without waiting on any court. The brass key was mine to use. Inside sat a slim folder containing the executed original of her real will. Signatures and seals intact, witnessed and dated 2 years back. Margaret laid it beside a copy of Wade's version on the bank's small conference table and put her glasses on. She didn't say much at first. Then she began pointing out the dates, the witness lines naming 2 people no one could quite locate, and the signature itself, which she called a careful imitation by someone who'd clearly studied the real thing. She'd seen forged documents before, she said, and they almost always made the same mistake. They tried too hard to look perfect. "A genuine signature from a sick woman wobbles," she said. "This one marches." She laid out the path forward plainly. We could file to reopen the probate, present the original will, and allege fraud. If the court agreed, the fraudulent will would be thrown out and everything done under it could be challenged. But that road was slow. Months, possibly a year, with my family fighting every step. Meanwhile, the auction would proceed on schedule and the house would sell. "So we fight on two fronts," I said. She raised an eyebrow. I laid out my plan. Form the company, buy the house cleanly at auction, then pursue the fraud case afterward so the rest of the truth landed exactly where it belonged. Margaret took off her glasses, studied me for a long moment, and almost smiled. "Your grandmother," she said, "would have liked that very much." Then she picked up her pen, and we got to work. The auction happened on a cold October morning in a county building meeting room full of folding chairs and burnt coffee. I didn't go in person. That was the entire point. Instead, I sent someone who could bid without a single eyebrow going up, a calm associate from Margaret's office, with my hard limit written on a card in his pocket. I sat in my car in the parking lot, phone in hand, heart in my throat. My mother and Brooke were inside. I'd watched them go in, dressed up, already celebrating. Margaret's associate texted updates. Bidding opened low, just as I'd predicted. The reserve set cheap for a fast sale. Then it climbed. A local farmer wanting the acreage. An investor from the city. And the quiet man in the good suit, nodding, raising the company's number, patient as a Tuesday afternoon. The price passed $200,000, then $220,000. My family, I'd learn later, was thrilled. Every raise meant more cash for them, with no idea who was driving it up or why. At $238,000, the room went still. The gavel came down, and the farmhouse on Cedar Hollow Road belonged to Cedar Hollow Holdings, LLC. My phone buzzed. "Sold to your company. Congratulations, Miss Finch." I sat in that cold car, pressed a hand over my mouth, and made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. My mother walked out of that building minutes later, beaming, mentally counting money, complaining to Brooke about that pushy company that had driven the price up. She passed within 30 feet of my car and never once looked over. She thought she'd won, thought she'd sold her mother-in-law's house to a stranger for top dollar. She had no idea she'd just sold it back to the granddaughter she swore was never in the will. The money moved the way money moves when people are desperate to spend it. My mother took the largest share, most of which went straight toward the second mortgage and debts she'd hidden from my father for years. Brooke finished paying off her SUV and booked a vacation. My father took whatever was handed to him and said thank you to no one. They celebrated it all over dinner, a dinner I wasn't invited to, which suited me fine because every dollar crossing that table was a dollar I'd paid for. I sat in my office above the hardware store the night the funds cleared and laid the new deed on my desk under the lamp. Cedar Hollow Holdings, LLC, owner of record. The farmhouse and 10 acres on Cedar Hollow Road. My company. My house. My grandmother's house, back where it belonged. And not one of them had any idea. I want to be honest about something, because this is the part people tend to get wrong. I didn't feel triumphant that night. I felt tired and sad, and a strange tenderness toward the woman who'd raised me, who'd seen this whole thing coming and armed me for it from beyond the grave. The triumph would come later. That night was just quiet. I traced the address on the deed with one finger and thought about the porch swing, the garden gone to weeds. They were spending my money to celebrate cutting me out of the family, and I let them. I let every check clear and every bottle get uncorked, because Christmas was coming, and my mother, who could never resist an audience, was about to gather the whole family at one table. I'd bring a hostess gift, 3 pieces of paper. The invitation arrived in early December, and it surprised me. My mother called, sweet as pie, inviting me to Christmas dinner. Not because she missed me. I knew her too well for that. She invited me for 2 reasons, and I could hear both underneath her cheerful voice. The first was theater. Nothing says this family has moved on, No hard feelings. Nothing to see here, like the prodigal bookkeeper at the holiday table. The second was nerves. Word had gotten around town that some company had been asking questions about the estate, requesting records, and my mother wanted to be sure I wasn't stirring a pot that might splash back on her. So she wrapped a leash in tinsel and called it an invitation. "You'll come, won't you?" she said. "It's Christmas. Let's put all this behind us." Then, because she couldn't help herself, because cruelty was a reflex she'd never bothered to unlearn, she added, "And let's not have any drama about the house. You know, you were never in the will. No need to ruin everyone's Christmas over it." I held the phone and looked out my office window at the string of lights over Main Street. I thought about Margaret's filing, drafted and ready to go the week after the holiday. I thought about the deed in my desk drawer and the letter in my bag, and I thought, you have no idea what you're inviting into your dining room. "I'll be there," I said warmly. "What can I bring?" She told me just myself. I told her I'd bring myself. And I meant it. I also meant the slim leather folder that would sit in my purse right beside the cranberry sauce. I won't pretend I didn't wrestle with it. For a week, I went back and forth on how to do this, because how you win matters almost as much as whether you win. I could have handled it cleanly and privately. Let Margaret's lawsuit land quietly in January, papers served through an attorney, not a word said at dinner. Part of me, the part Opal used to call my good quiet, wanted exactly that. It felt more dignified. But there was another truth I had to be honest with myself about. They'd shamed me in public. At the will reading, at the funeral, at every holiday for years. And they'd done it on purpose, because an audience made it stick. The smirk only worked because other people were watching. So maybe the truth deserved the same room the lies had used. I pulled out Opal's letter and read it again. Don't fight them with shouting. Let the paper speak. And there was my answer, in her own hand. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to throw wine or make a scene or say any of the cutting things I'd rehearsed in the shower. I was going to sit at that table, calm as a frozen pond, and set 3 documents down and let them do the talking. No raised voice, no insults, just facts laid out in order, the way I lay out a ledger. That week, I signed the authorization for Margaret to file the petition to reopen probate the first business day after Christmas. The legal machinery was set. The dinner would simply be the moment the family learned the truth from me instead of from a process server. The thing about a lie with more than one person in it is that it's only as strong as its most frightened participant, and Wade was getting frightened. I heard about it secondhand, then saw it for myself. Word had reached him that a company had requested the full estate file from the county, including the probate documents and the will he'd notarized. To a crooked notary, that's the sound of a floorboard creaking in a house he thought was empty. Wade called my mother in a panic. I know because I happened to stop by my parents' place 2 days before Christmas, dropping off a poinsettia like a dutiful daughter, and overheard her in the kitchen, voice low and sharp. "Stop calling here," she hissed. "Nobody is investigating anything. You did your job. You got paid. Now act normal." A pause. "Because if you fall apart, Wade, you take all of us down with you, including yourself." She hung up hard. I stood in the hallway with my poinsettia and my pleasant face and filed the whole thing away. So Wade had been paid. A notary doesn't collect a special fee for honest work. The price list is posted right on the wall. Wade had been paid for something else entirely. The fraud wasn't just real. It was already cracking from the inside, and my mother was holding it together with threats. I drove home through the Christmas lights thinking I might not even need to push very hard. People who build their houses out of lies spend all their energy bracing the walls. Sometimes the truth only has to knock politely and wait. 2 more days. I could wait 2 more days. In a small town, a farmhouse changing hands is news. People had started talking. At the grocery store, the feed store, the post office, asking sideways questions the way you do when you're fishing for something. Who'd bought the old Finch place? Was it being torn down? Some developer? I kept my expression neutral and said I didn't know much, which felt strange, lying by omission to neighbors who'd loved Opal. But one moment cut straight through me. I was downstairs at the hardware store when old Mr. Petrie, who'd farmed beside my grandmother for 40 years, stopped me by the nails. "Heard whoever bought Opal's place means to keep her garden," he said, voice rough. "Heard they're not tearing anything down. That true?" Someone at the title company must have talked. I looked at him and couldn't lie about that one. "It's true," I said. "The garden stays." His old eyes went bright, and he gripped my arm. "Good," he said. "She'd be glad. That woman loved her tomatoes more than most people love their own kin." Then he went back to his nails, and I stood there blinking. Because that was the whole point, wasn't it? That was why I'd drained my savings and mortgaged my future and built a company with a careful name. Not to ruin my family, not even really to win. I bought that house to keep a promise, to keep her garden in the ground, her name on the land, her porch swing creaking the same crooked way it always had. The revenge, if you want to call it that, was almost a side effect. The real thing was simpler. Somebody in this family was going to remember the woman, not just the money. And it was going to be me. The night before Christmas Eve, I sat at my kitchen table and assembled my folder. I've done this for clients 100 times, arranging documents so they tell a true story in the right order. I'd never done it for myself before. I laid out 3 pieces of paper. First, a copy of the deed. Cedar Hollow Holdings, LLC, owner of record, dated the day of the auction. Second, the conformed copy of my grandmother's real will, Margaret's seal in the corner, my name in the body. The house goes to my granddaughter Simone, the one who stayed. Third, Opal's letter, in her own hand, the one that said let the paper speak. I slid each into the leather folder in the order I'd reveal them. Deed first, to prove ownership. Will second, to show it was always meant to be mine. Letter last, because the letter was the heart, and you save the heart for the end. I sat back and looked at the small stack. 3 pages. 1 quiet sentence to go with them, already chosen, already rehearsed until every trace of a shake had left it. That's all it would take to turn my mother's victory dinner into the worst night of her life. I won't pretend my hand didn't hover over that deed for a long moment. Once I set this down, there was no picking it back up, no returning to being the daughter who kept the peace. I'd become the daughter who told the truth, and they'd never forgive me for it. I closed the folder. I'd made peace with that price weeks earlier. Some things are worth not being forgiven for. On Christmas Eve, my father did something he'd never once done in my life. He came to me. I was closing up the office when I saw his truck idling at the curb, exhaust curling up into the cold. He climbed the stairs slowly, hat in his hands, looking older than I'd ever seen him. "Your grandmother," he started, then stopped. He tried again. There were papers I signed, part of the probate. He turned the hat over in his hands. I didn't read them close. I should have read them close. It was as near to a confession as Raymond Finch had in him. I waited, because I'd learned that men like my father say the real thing only in the silence you leave open for it. "Wade put it in front of me," he said finally. "Your mother said it was just formalities. I knew something wasn't right about it. I signed anyway." There it was. He'd known. Not every detail, maybe, but enough. He'd known something was wrong and chosen the easy quiet over his own daughter, same as always. I felt the old ache rise, and beneath it, something steadier. I didn't yell. I didn't absolve him either. "I know you did, Dad," I said. He flinched like I'd struck him, which was more honest than anything I could have shouted. He stood there a moment longer, hoping I'd make it easier, hoping I'd tell him it was fine. I didn't, because it wasn't. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and went down the stairs. I watched his taillights disappear and thought, tomorrow you'll learn the rest. Christmas Day, I put on the plain sweater Opal would have approved of and drove across town to my parents' house. 10 minutes, maybe, past the same lit-up lawns and inflatable snowmen. I was calm in a way that surprised even me. The folder sat in my purse on the passenger seat. I didn't rehearse anything on the drive. I'd already done all my rehearsing. I just drove and watched the town go by and let the weight of what I was about to do settle into something solid. I thought about Opal teaching me to add columns out loud at her kitchen table. Numbers don't lie, Simone. People do. I thought about how long I'd let people lie about me to my own face, in front of others, for the sake of a peace that only ever protected them. That was over. I parked behind Brooke's enormous new SUV, the one bought with my money, and sat for one breath with my hands on the wheel. Then I picked up my purse, felt the folder's edge press against my palm, and walked up the path toward a door where I could already hear them laughing inside. The dining room was warm and bright and smelled of pine, roast, and cinnamon. My mother had outdone herself. The good china out, candles lit, a red and gold centerpiece. The whole cast was there. My father at the foot of the table, quiet. Brooke and her husband Travis near the middle, wine already poured. My uncle Gary and his wife. And Wade, sweating slightly in a holiday sweater, parked near the end like a man who wanted easy access to the door. My mother presided at the head of the table, glowing, refilling glasses, queen of a kingdom she believed was secure. She greeted me with a hug that was pure performance and seated me at her right hand, the seat of honor, so everyone could witness how gracious she was being to the difficult daughter. I let her. I complimented the table. I passed the rolls. I asked Travis about work and admired the tree. By every outward measure, I was a perfectly pleasant dinner guest. Inside, I'd never been more still. We ate. We toasted the season. Then, between the main course and the pie, my mother tapped her glass with her fork and announced she had a little news to share. Worth celebrating, she said. Here we go, I thought. Here we go. My mother stood, wine glass raised, and the table quieted the way it always did for her. I just want to say, she began, what a hard year it's been, losing Mother Finch. She pressed a hand to her chest. But we got through it together, as a family, and I'm happy to share that we finally closed the sale of her house last month. It's done. We can all move forward now. Glasses lifted around the table. Brooke said, "Cheers, Mom." Then my mother's eyes slid over to me, and the smirk surfaced, the one that needed an audience to work. I know that's been a sore spot for some, she said lightly, swirling her wine, looking right at me. But honestly, sweetheart, you were never in the will anyway. No shame in it. Grandma just knew who'd handle things responsibly. A few uncomfortable laughs. Travis studied his plate. My father went very still. The whole table waited to see whether I'd cry, argue, or slink away the way I always had. The way I was supposed to. I set down my fork. I didn't reach for the folder yet. Not yet. I just looked at my mother and let a small silence stretch. The kind that makes confident people start to wonder. Brooke, who could never tolerate silence, rushed to fill it. She laughed, that bright, careless laugh she'd had since childhood, and lifted her glass toward me like she was doing me a favor. Don't feel bad, Simone, she said. Honestly, it's for the best. You'd have just wasted it. There it was again. The matching knife, delivered with a smile, right there between the turkey and the pie. Travis murmured, Brooke, come on. But she waved him off, pleased with herself. My uncle shifted in his seat. Wade reached for his water glass and missed it on the first try. And I sat there, in the seat of honor at my mother's right hand, and felt the last bit of hesitation leave my body. They'd both had their say. In public, on record, in front of every witness at that table. They'd made themselves perfectly clear. I picked up my napkin, folded it, and set it beside my plate slowly and deliberately, the way Opal used to when she'd decided a conversation was over. Then I reached for my wine, took one unhurried sip while the table watched, and set the glass back down. In the same pleasant tone I'd used about the dinner rolls, I asked my mother a simple question. Can I ask who you sold it to? She blinked, thrown by how calm I was. What? The house, I said. Who bought it? She recovered quickly, because she loved telling this part. Some company, she said with a little wave. Cedar Hollow Holdings, I think. An investment outfit. They bid us up nicely, actually. Paid well over what we expected. She smiled around the table, gathering her admiration. So really, it worked out for everyone. Cedar Hollow Holdings, I repeated, as if making sure I had it right. That's right, she said. Why? I felt that whole strange year converge on this single point. The funeral, the forged will, the cold car in the auction parking lot, all of it funneling toward the next 60 seconds. The candles flickered. The pie cooled. 11 people waited without knowing what they were waiting for. I reached into my purse, and my hand closed around the leather folder. I brought it up and set it on the table beside my plate. I opened it and pulled out the first page. This is the deed to Grandma's house, I said, laying it in the center of the table, turned so my mother could read it. Recorded the day of the auction. She glanced down, impatient. Then her eyes caught the owner's name and stopped. Cedar Hollow Holdings, LLC. I don't understand, she said, and her voice had already changed. I pulled out the second page. This is Grandma's real will, I said, drafted 2 years ago by Margaret Howren, signed, witnessed, properly notarized. I set it beside the deed. It leaves the farmhouse and 10 acres to me, by name. The color was draining from my mother's face now, like someone had pulled a plug. Brooke leaned in to read and went silent. Wade pushed his chair back from the table. I pulled out the third page last, holding it a moment before setting it down, because this one was hers, in her own hand. And this, I said, is the letter she left me, the one that told me exactly what you'd do. The table had gone so quiet I could hear the candle flames. Every eye moved from the papers to my mother, then to me. I folded my hands and let them look. My mother looked up from the papers and, for once in her life, had nothing to say. So I said it for her, in a voice as level as a countertop. Cool, I said. I hope you enjoyed spending the cash. A beat. Since I'm the one who bought it. The words landed soft and detonated slow. Cedar Hollow Holdings is mine, I said. I formed it. I bid on it. The money you all spent this fall. The mortgage, the SUV, the vacation. That was my money. I bought Grandma's house back from you, and not one of you noticed. My mother's mouth opened and closed. Then she found her voice, and it came out exactly the way I knew it would. Loud, scrambling, furious. That's a lie, she said, half rising, her wine tipping and bleeding across the white tablecloth. That's not. Wade, tell her. Tell her that will isn't real. But Wade was already on his feet, gray as ash, backing toward the door, muttering that he had to go, that he wasn't part of any of this. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just placed one hand flat on Opal's letter and looked at my mother across the ruined tablecloth. You said I was never in the will, I said. You were right. Because the one I was in, you replaced. And I have the original. The candles burned. Nobody moved. The room fell into that deep, ringing silence where everyone understands something at the exact same instant, and no one wants to be the one who speaks first. Brooke had gone the color of the tablecloth. I watched her do the arithmetic, watched it cross her face as she realized the giant SUV in the driveway had been bought with money that was about to be clawed back, money that had never really been hers. Her hand drifted off her wine glass. My father had his eyes shut. My uncle stared at his plate as if it might tell him what to do. I looked at my sister, who'd laughed and told me I'd waste it, and gave her the only answer that mattered. Turns out I didn't waste it, I said quietly. I bought back the only thing in this family that was ever worth keeping. Somewhere in the kitchen, the oven timer went off for the second pie, cheerful and absurd, and nobody got up to answer it. I didn't stay for dessert. I gathered my 3 pages back into their folder, thanked my mother for dinner with a courtesy that landed harder than any insult could have, and drove home through the Christmas lights with steady hands on the wheel. The rest unfolded the way Margaret had predicted, just faster, because a lie cracks quickest once everyone can see it. She filed the petition to reopen probate the first business day after the holiday. We presented the original will alongside the evidence of forgery, and the court took it seriously. Wade's notary commission came under review within weeks, facing the loss of his license. And worse, He stopped pretending he'd done anything by the book, and the document he'd notarized fell apart under the first real scrutiny. With the fraudulent will discredited, the court reopened the estate under Opal's real will, the one leaving the house to me. My purchase at the public auction stood on its own. I'd bought it at arm's length, at fair market value, as an honest buyer, and a court won't claw back a house from a clean, good faith sale. What did unwind was the money. The cash my family had already split had come out of an estate emptied through a forged document, and the court ordered it returned. My mother, who'd already spent her share covering debts she'd hidden for years, now owed it back with nowhere to find it, and the careful image she'd built around town collapsed in public. Which, to her, was the worst part of all. Brooke had to sell the new SUV to scrape together her share of what was owed. My father moved into the spare room and, last I heard, wasn't sleeping well. I took no joy in the hard parts, and I want you to believe that. But I took no responsibility for them either, because I didn't forge anything, I didn't lie, and I didn't reach for a single dollar that wasn't mine. As for me, I kept the house both ways. It worked out exactly as I'd planned and exactly as the law decided. The auction made me the owner. The real will made me the heir. 2 different roads, the same front door. That spring, I drove out to Cedar Hollow Road, fixed the crooked porch swing, and turned the soil in Opal's garden with my own hands. Mr. Petrie stopped by with tomato starts and didn't say much, which was its own kind of blessing. I left the door open for my father once, with one condition. "It's open," I told him, "whenever you're ready to be honest." He hasn't walked through it yet. Maybe he will. Maybe he won't. Either way, the garden's planted, and the swing still creaks exactly the way it always did. Here's what I learned, sitting in that quiet house that used to be hers. Family can vote you out of the story all they want, but the ones who actually stay are the ones who get to keep the house, the name, and the truth. That's where I'll leave it tonight. The smirk, the toast, 3 pieces of paper on a ruined Christmas tablecloth. If you've ever been the one who stayed while everyone else showed up only to collect, this story was for you. So do one quiet thing for me this week. Go check the paperwork on the things that matter. The deeds, the wills, the promises. Gently and early, long before you'd ever need to raise your voice. Comment, "The one who stayed." If you made it this far with me, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Arms Never Sleep, because there's always another family, another table, and another truth waiting to be laid down.